it's striking that the Brexit issue, how much it's moved on in the minds of voters, red wall voters and others. And it seems fairly clear what it is they want, but it is pretty clear. And it seems to me that unless rejoin, whether it's a single market or the EU, is about A, jobs, i.e. investment flow to British business to create jobs, pay taxes, and B, a better immigration outcome, then rejoin has no merit and has no purpose, really, that I'm strongly detecting. What we need is the investment flow to come back into UK business. That gives us the jobs. And clearly we also need a better immigration system than we had at the time of Brexit. And the Red Wall are aware of both of those and are amazingly nuanced in their approach to them. It's how do we achieve that? How can we present rejoin as offering those benefits?
I'm sure you're right. And I'm not so sure that we necessarily need to see everything through the lens of joining or rejoining, which, you know, personally I think is still sort of some way off. But the only slight anxiety I have in what you say is that I don't think it will be sensible for people who want to join. I really want to say join now, not rejoin, because I think it's just I think it needs to be a forward-looking proposition, right?
Yes.
But I think people wanting to make the case for join, I don't think it's going to be a good idea to make that simply in terms of the case of saying, well, you know, Brexit has been very economically damaging. We need to do this in order to to get more investment, to get more jobs, and so on and so forth. I mean, of course, that would be part of the case, but I do kind of feel as if one of the reasons, looking back over the long term, that the way in which Britain entered Europe did set up many of the conditions for how we ended up leaving. And I mean by that, you know, this idea particularly of sort of joining as a way of getting out of the economic crises of the 1970s. So I would also like to sort of see an articulation of a sort of not exactly idealistic, but a sort of not just a sort of what could we get out of it case for joining.
It's really your whole life of presenting a marketing is you have to offer the benefits of what you're selling. And unless you can make the benefits clear cut, they don't bother to try the sale process, do something else. So I think we have to find a way of defining benefits and then selling them, particularly since we're selling into an audience that already indicated that is what they want to an astonishing degree.
Yeah.
As part of that, you also explain, you, me, Gavin, we will never really be in the single market. It is British business that needs to be in the single market. And you can depersonalize the issue. They need to have free access to the market. They need to have an open door, or investment stays low, jobs stay low, for public services, for defence, etc. So I think you can link those two and de-emotionalize the issue quite a lot and get to very specific benefits.
I get that, Kevin, but I mean, wasn't that really the strategy that the Remain campaign used in the 2016 referendum? Don't you think?
But what's changed is the attitude of the voter, Chris. Red Wall, I'm reading focus group stuff in 2017, 18, 19. They were much more accepting of the idea of quite a level of immigration than they were in 2015, when the whole country was massively hostile. They accepted they need looking after in their old age, and their children are going to do it. One of the things they wanted were migrants, whether asylum or immigrants, migrants coming in who could be integrated more easily. In my speak, that would be white European rather than others. So it's an irony that what the rejoin proposition is actually very close to what voters have been saying since 2019-ish, but we're not able to express it.
To what extent is it possible to unpick the effects of Brexit from all the other things that are going on, COVID, Ukraine, the invasion of Iran, and do people really understand what leaving the ECHR would mean for them?
I suppose that the first question relates to economic effects, and this is, this is constantly is kind of contested, and of course it is very difficult to separate out those different kinds of things and those different impacts. But I think it is at one level, all of the noise around this is kind of irrelevant, in as much as how could it be, it goes back actually to what Kevin was just saying, how could it be that having greater trade barriers with the partner with whom you do about half of your trade, how could that be anything other than economically damaging, regardless of all of these other things that have happened? So even without getting into the complexities of trying to quantify it, we can just kind of say, as a matter of principle, that this must be so. So on to the second thing about ECHR. I mean, I think the ECHR thing is very interesting before I come back to the question, but it's very interesting for the fact that, as I'm sure other people on this call were, I had a lot of conversations and was involved in the campaigning before the referendum, and every time I talked to somebody who once was talking about voting to leave, and when issues came up about, being subjected to Brussels law and so on. So what laws do you object to? And they always referred to, I think this is true, I think without exception, in any number of conversations I had, what they always made reference to was things which were not the EU, which were ECHR things. So it was typically kind of things about, giving prisoners the vote, or not being able to deport people, or someone having the right to a family life with their cat, or I mean, most of these stories were not even true. But the point is, what they were ultimately referencing was the European Court the European Court of Human Rights, not the European Courts of Justice, for example. And so, in a sense, already embedded within Brexit was this idea of Brexit 2.0, of leaving of ECHR derogation. Now, whether people, and I don't, so on to the question, do people have any idea what that would actually mean for them? Well, I think the answer to that is no, in exactly the same way as most people didn't have any idea about what Brexit was going to mean either. I mean, I don't think they have any idea of what it means in terms of international agreements and international obligations. And ultimately, and it is extraordinary in a way that this goes hand in hand with so much distrust of politicians, because what they're really saying is that they believe that always and forever, for all time, that British politicians will not enact laws which curtail their human rights. That they, as individuals, say, as an individual, you will no longer have any redress, any extra territorial redress to what your government may choose to do to you. And I mean, I think in terms of, if we get to the point of this being a realistic thing, then I think that the campaign to stay in the European Convention of Human Rights really ought to try and tap into that and say, do you really trust British politicians forever and a day never to violate your human rights?
Earlier on in the discussion, you mentioned about a Brexiteer nostalgia, and my comment was that they may have nostalgia, but I, as people who didn't want to leave and who want to rejoin, we have nostalgias as well. And so it's kind of one nostalgia pitted up against the other. And likewise, later on, you mentioned about Brexiteers and Brexitism feeling cheated of the past.
Mm.
And all I can say is rejoiners and Europhiles feel cheated about our present and the future. And we are in this sort of two sides of the same coin, in terms of European population. We all feel cheated and nobody feels satisfied.
I think that in the long term, if you think about what is going to happen demographically, is that what is already happening. I mean, already we've seen calculations. It's rather brutal, of course, but there are calculations showing, that the number of people who voted leave who have now died, and of course it's a disproportionate number because people who were older voted disproportionately to leave. But what that means is that in, say, 10 years' time, 20 years' time, even whatever, that the generation of people who at the time of the referendum were perhaps in their late teens, perhaps not even quite old enough to vote, or perhaps just old enough to, that their nostalgia will become potentially a kind of a political force in the way that the nostalgia of the over 60s and over 70s and over 80s has been in recent British politics. So it could actually, you could easily imagine, people beginning to talk more about, do you remember the good old days? The good old days when we were in Europe, when we could, travel easily, when we could, all these kinds of things. So yes, so nostalgia may well cut both ways.
I certainly live with a lot of nostalgia.
I remember the morning after the referendum, when the vote, when we knew the result, and I can, and I wrote something which I know a lot of other people felt the same, of this feeling of suddenly being in exile, and actually, I mean, of course, 10 years goes by, and some of that sort of heals, but I still fundamentally feel that now.
Just on that point, though, I feel that the resentment is just as deep now as it ever was, principally because it was a crime what happened in Brexit. It was a crime because of Russian intervention. It was a crime because of flagrant disregard to the financial rules. And it was the whole way in which the campaign was run was full of lies, and it was even the question. Nobody defined what Brexit was, and that's all seems to have been lost. But my questions are, first of all, whatever happened? We had UKIP, and then we had Brexit Party, and now we've got Reform, but nobody ever talks these days about the National Front or British National Party or the English Party. Do they still exist? Do you know? And my third question was going to be, I can't understand how Nigel Farage can get away with criticising the boat, arguing about the boat people coming out. How many people came out over last week because the weather changed and he goes on and on about the boat people, whereas in fact it was Brexit that created the problem, and nobody's pointing that out, as far as I can see.
It's very interesting what's happened on the far right, and I mean, I'm not 100% certain of the answer, but I think that the BNP still exists and the National Front still exists in very sort of small splinter group kind of form, but obviously you've got this much more assertive group. I can't even remember what they're called now, but the Tommy Robinson group. I'm sure someone else will know the name that they call themselves by. But I think, but also, I think the point that I made before is that part of this situation of this political landscape that's been created is that those people have been sucked into. Interestingly, quite a lot of them are quite hostile to Reform and Farage because they see them as being weak on immigration. They see them as being, and of course, particularly they dislike the fact that there's quite a lot of ethnic minority people. The party I don't know what I can't remember what role he has now. That the party he was the party chairman, um, who's from ethnic minority, and the fact that they've taken MPs like Suella Braverman into the party, and so those people have much more lined up with the Restore people who are sort of very ethno nationalist. But I would say that what's happened is that yeah, is that that kind of far right stuff has become made sort of somewhat more respectable, you know. Um, and you can certainly sort of see the people who were doing the raise the flags, the people who started that in Birmingham. I mean, they had strong links to, I don't know which group it was, but to kind of these very extreme kind of neo-Nazi groups. So and yet that raising the flags, has been at least attempted to be sort of portrayed as being, oh, this is just sort of ordinary English folk. You see, so yes, so that's where those far right people are. The Brexit and the boats, the small boats thing. I actually have to take issue with you a bit there, and I think it is much more complicated than this. And the reason why the argument you're putting forward has not gained very much traction is because the truth is a lot more fiddly than it just being Brexit or not Brexit. Now, it is true that it is true that, say, at the time of the referendum, there were not small boat crossings. The small boat crossings started after, but they started before Britain left the EU, and they started before the end of the transition period, and then increased. And so you can't ascribe the beginning of the small boats to having left the EU. The reason why the small boats began was because of the fact that the other routes had been primarily the train routes around the Eurotunnel and so on, had been wired off. And if you've been in recent years anywhere around there, you see these enormous fortified barbed wire lines and so on and so forth. Now, the question then is, and therefore the small boat thing increased. Now then, one of the Brexit connections potentially is to say that because we left the Dublin Accord, that it was no longer possible to return people to the country which they had first made their claim. But that's very. It was only a relatively small number of people who fell into that category. Okay, so there were not huge numbers of people being returned under Dublin regulations. There were some, but there were not a huge number. And so again, it's not quite so clear cut to say it's because of Brexit. Now there are people who argue, and I think there's some truth in it. They say that Brexit still did have an effect, because the fact that people couldn't be returned by Dublin regulations, even if we were not doing a lot of that before, that this then created a new incentive for people to seek the UK as their destination, because of the fact that they knew that Dublin regulations wouldn't apply. Okay, but as soon as you get into that, it's all too fiddly and too tricksy to make as a knockdown argument. So every time the argument is put to reform people, then they just easily bat it. They just easily bat it back by saying, "But we hardly returned any people before," and they're right.
Yeah.
So it's not that there isn't any Brexit connection, but that, like a lot of Brexit things, it turns out that once you get into the details, it's all much more. It's much more difficult, and that's the reason I think why that argument has failed and will continue to fail to land in terms of challenging these people. I say not because there's nothing in it, but because there isn't quite enough. It's not quite an easy and straightforward enough thing in order for it really to be a knockout blow, if that makes sense. I just wanted to pick up on something I can see in the comments, which is a comment by Greg Newman. And in the comments, I can see he says, is there some confounding in the voters' minds of the terms immigration and asylum that the government could clarify? And I do think, and it also goes back to what John was saying just now about asylum seekers, I do really strongly feel that this is something where the government could take much more of a lead, because there's no doubt in my mind that people, and again, going back to Kevin, I think he's probably right that, say, red wall voters who voted leave have a reasonably nuanced view of immigration and do accept the economic argument for immigration, but all the time, though, immigration and asylum have been conflated, and so when you see, I mean, they're not necessarily representative, but when you see these kind of vox pops of voters talking about immigration, they always seem to me to talk about, oh, but they're all coming over on these boats, and that's what they mean by uncontrolled immigration. They get the numbers wrong, all the rest of it, but they basically, and because of the fact that the national immigration figures, the headline figures, they include sort of regular migration. They include irregular migration or asylum seekers. They also include student numbers, which is a terrible mistake in my view, because this is a fundamentally different kind of category. And it seems to me, I mean, although just government statistics in themselves, it's not going to be the answer to this, but it does seem to me as if politicians could really insist on the fact that these are three different, distinct categories with three distinct policy choices associated with them. So that's one thing. And I mean, the other thing, which is obvious, I suppose, but I do wish that the government would kind of say more, which is that the phenomenon of refugees and asylum seekers, is an international, global thing, which is not going to go away. It's not. It's part and parcel of the contemporary world, and it has various kinds of drivers, and the bulk of it actually takes place in other parts of the world. I mean, this is the situation we've written is the very far end ripple effect of a big, long kind of thing. And I think that that if, I mean, I'm reluctant to talk about this as a problem because I it's a very dehumanizing way of talking about it in itself. But if we consider it to be a policy problem, then I think that politicians, sort of saying we are going to stop the boats, they're being fundamentally dishonest, and I think that if it could instead be, okay, so this is something that we have got to manage rather than something which we've got to solve and put an end to, then I would like to think that at least some voters will understand that.